Why are you here? It's a strange thing to hear inside a palace. Stranger still when it's spoken by a king. Not raised, not barked, just dropped into the air. Flat, controlled, almost polite, and somehow colder for it. Why are you here? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The clip doesn't begin with chaos. There's no shouting, no scrambling aides, no dramatic camera shake. That's part of what makes it unsettling. The room looks composed. The people in it look prepared. Everything, at first glance, appears to be operating within the smooth choreography that palaces have perfected over centuries. And then that question lands. You don't hear it shouted from across a hall. It's closer than that. Intimate. Close enough to feel like it wasn't meant for public consumption at all. Close enough to feel like we were never supposed to hear it. Why are you here? It's the kind of question that assumes something has already gone wrong. Because in that moment, the most powerful man in the room is no longer delivering a line. He's reacting. And reaction, inside Buckingham Palace, is rare. Reaction is what the system is designed to prevent. Let me be clear about something early on. This story is not about a single clip. Not really. Clips come and go. But they're leaked, dissected, argued over, and then replaced by the next outrage, the next distraction. What makes this different isn't the footage itself. It's the tone, the timing, the fact that this moment exists at all. And maybe, more importantly, the fact that it wasn't meant to. Because nothing at Buckingham Palace is spontaneous. Not entrances, not greetings, not facial expressions caught by accident. Every movement is rehearsed, every interaction buffered by layers of protocol, staff, and advanced planning. Even surprise has rules. Especially, so when something cuts through that system, even briefly, it's worth asking why. And who failed to stop it? Or who chose not to? The clip surfaced quietly. No dramatic premiere, no official confirmation. It didn't arrive with context or explanation. It simply appeared, passed hand to hand, and then began to vanish again almost as quickly as it had emerged. Some saw it once and couldn't find it again. Others heard about it but never managed to track it down. A few saved it, watched it repeatedly, and noticed details others missed. Details like the pause before the question. Details like the lack of greeting. Details like what doesn't happen after the words are spoken. Because, here's the first contradiction. If this was nothing, if it was harmless, if it was a misunderstanding blown out of proportion, why did it disappear? Why wasn't it clarified? Why wasn't it laughed off, reframed, neutralized? Palaces are very good at neutralizing things. Silence, in this context, is not absence. It's a choice, and that choice tells us something mattered. To understand why, we have to talk about the setting. Not in the tourist sense, not the postcard version of Buckingham Palace with its gates and guards and ceremonial precision. We're talking about the interior world, the operational one, the place where hierarchy isn't symbolic, it's functional. Inside that world, surprise appearances are not charming, they're disruptive. They introduce uncertainty into a system built on predictability. They raise questions that shouldn't need to be asked. Questions like, who approved this? Who didn't? And who is now responsible for explaining it? Because whether people want to admit it or not, the moment someone unexpected appears inside that space, the issue isn't personal, it's procedural. And procedure is power. This is why the question matters. Why are you here? It's not just curiosity. It's not small talk. It's an audit, a boundary check, a signal that something has crossed a line without permission. And here's where the story becomes uncomfortable, because the person on the receiving end of that question is not a stranger, not a lost tourist, not an uninvited guest who wandered too far. This is someone whose presence inside that building carries weight, history, controversy, layers of unresolved tension, which raises another question, one we don't hear spoken in the clip, but feel hovering around it. If she wasn't supposed to be there, how did she get in? There's a temptation, especially online, to flatten moments like this into sides, to turn it into a simple confrontation. King versus Duchess. Authority versus defiance. But that framing misses what's actually interesting here. Because the most revealing thing about this moment isn't anger, it's restraint. Anger is loud. Anger draws attention to itself. Anger invites escalation. What we see instead is something quieter, controlled, almost surgical. That suggests calculation, and calculation suggests forethought, which brings us to timing. Because timing in stories like this is never incidental. This appearance didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened at a moment when the institution is already under strain, when every public image is scrutinized not just for what it shows, but for what it implies, when unity is not assumed, but actively performed. In that context, an unscheduled appearance isn't just a logistical problem. It's a narrative threat. Ask yourself this: if everything were settled, if relationships were stable, if boundaries were clear, would this moment have felt so charged? Or would it have passed unnoticed? The tension tells us something hasn't healed, and the clip tells us someone wasn't prepared. Which leads to another uncomfortable detail. The person asking the question doesn't look confused. He doesn't look startled. He looks irritated. Not explosively so, but in that controlled, narrowed way that suggests he's reacting to a breach, not a surprise. That distinction matters. Because surprise can be forgiven, breach cannot. Inside institutions like this, authority isn't asserted by volume. It's asserted by calm, by the ability to remain composed while everyone else recalibrates around you. That's what gives the question its weight. It's not dramatic. It doesn't need to be. It lands because it shouldn't have needed to be asked at all. Now, let's pause here and talk about something else you may have noticed. Or maybe you didn't, at least not consciously. There's no immediate response captured in the clip, no apology, no explanation, no visible scramble to smooth things over. The camera doesn't linger long enough for that. Or perhaps it was never pointed in that direction to begin with. Which raises another question. Who was filming? Because cameras inside Buckingham Palace don't just exist. They are placed, approved, controlled. Or, if they are unofficial, they are hidden. And hidden cameras imply intent. Someone wanted this moment recorded, or someone failed to stop it. Either way, it slipped through. And when something slips through a system designed to prevent leaks, it usually means one of two things. Either the system failed, or someone within it decided not to intervene. Both possibilities are troubling. Now, at this point, it's important to resist the urge to jump ahead, to assign motives, to declare winners and losers. That's not how stories like this reveal themselves. They unfold slowly, through pattern and absence, as much as through action. So let's stay with what we know. We know the appearance was unexpected. We know the reaction was not rehearsed. We know the clip was not meant to circulate. And we know that the silence afterward was deliberate. Those facts alone are enough to tell us this wasn't nothing. And yet, publicly, almost nothing was said. No formal acknowledgement, no official framing, no attempt to contextualize the moment in a reassuring way. Instead, the palace did what it often does when something touches a nerve. It went quiet. Silence can be a strategy, but it can also be an admission that there is no clean explanation. Because how do you explain a question like that without opening doors you'd rather keep closed? How do you explain why someone was there without explaining who said yes? And how do you explain who said yes without explaining who lost control? This is where the story begins to stretch beyond a single exchange. Because the question, "Why are you here?" doesn't just apply to one person. It echoes outward. Why was this allowed to happen? Why now? Why in this way? And why does it feel like we're only seeing the smallest part of it? There's another layer here, one that's easy to miss if you focus too narrowly on personalities. Institutions like this operate on memory. Long memory. They don't forget slights. They don't forget disruptions. They don't forget moments when the script is broken. Which means this moment didn't just register emotionally, it registered structurally. Somewhere, after the cameras stopped, after the clip ended, conversations happened. Decisions were made, notes were taken, lines were drawn or redrawn, And that's where the real story begins. Because what happens after a breach is often more revealing than the breach itself. Did someone get reprimanded? Did procedures change? Did access tighten? Or did something else happen quietly, something we haven't seen yet? There's a reason this clip keeps resurfacing in conversation, even as the footage itself remains elusive. It's because it feels unresolved, like a sentence cut off mid-thought, like a door left ajar just enough to let something unsettling through. You can feel that unease in the way people talk about it. Not with outrage, but with uncertainty, with that slightly lowered voice people use when they sense there's more beneath the surface. And there is more, much more. But before we can get there, before we can talk about approvals and power and what this moment reveals about the state of things behind the scenes, we need to understand one crucial fact. This wasn't just about someone showing up unannounced. It was about the palace losing control of the narrative, even briefly. And that, inside Buckingham Palace, is never taken lightly. Because when the narrative slips, so does authority. And the question, "Why are you here?" wasn't just aimed at a person standing in the room. It was aimed at the situation itself, at the breakdown, at the failure of the system to anticipate what was coming. And in the next section, we're going to talk about the clip itself. Not what it shows on the surface, but what its existence tells us about who wanted this moment captured and why it was never supposed to reach us at all. Because once you understand how carefully these moments are usually controlled, the fact that this one escaped becomes impossible to ignore. And that's where things start to get uncomfortable. The clip wasn't meant to exist. That's not a dramatic flourish, it's a logistical reality. Inside Buckingham Palace, moments don't simply happen and then wander into the public sphere by accident. They are contained, filtered, logged, and, when necessary, buried. The palace is not careless with images. It's methodical, which is why the first and most important question about this footage isn't what it shows, it's why it escaped. If you trace the clip backward, you don't arrive at a newsroom or a press briefing. You arrive at something messier. Fragmented sightings, inconsistent accounts, people who swear they saw it once and then couldn't find it again, others who describe the same moment but disagree on tiny details, where the camera was positioned, how long the pause lasted, whether the words came before or after a slight shift in stance. That inconsistency is the tell. When something is officially released, it arrives complete, framed, explained. When something leaks, it arrives jagged, partial, uneven. And this was jagged from the start. The clip didn't trend in the way viral footage usually does. It didn't explode outward. It crept. A private message here, a quiet repost there, a whisper that something existed, followed by the immediate question, "Have you seen it?" That's not how the palace prefers to be discussed. And yet, for a brief window, that's exactly what happened. Now, let's slow this down. Because the instinct is to rush to conclusions, to assume sabotage, betrayal, or a deliberate leak designed to embarrass King Charles III, or elevate someone else. But those explanations are too neat. They assume intent, where ambiguity is far more dangerous. What we know is simpler, and in some ways more unsettling. The clip exists, or existed. Enough people saw it to confirm its reality. Enough details align to establish that this wasn't a fabrication or a deep fake stitched together for outrage. But it was never stabilized into a single authoritative version, which suggests it was never meant to circulate at all. Inside the palace, there are layers of recording. Official cameras for documentation, media teams for approved engagements, security systems that capture movement without concern for optics. And then there are personal devices, phones, tablets, small, easily concealed pieces of technology carried by people who are trusted enough to be there. Every layer has rules. Official footage is locked down. Media footage is cleared. Security footage is compartmentalized. Personal devices, however, exist in a gray zone. They're allowed in some contexts, forbidden in others, and monitored unevenly depending on the event. Which raises a question we don't ask often enough. What kind of camera captured this? Because the clip doesn't look like broadcast footage. It lacks the polish. The framing isn't ceremonial. It feels closer, less intentional. as if the person holding the camera wasn't thinking about history, but about immediacy, about capturing a moment before it slipped away. That alone narrows the field. It wasn't staged, it wasn't planned, it was reactive. And reactive footage is the hardest to control once it exists. But here's where it gets more interesting, because even reactive footage doesn't leave the palace without resistance. Files are deleted, devices are checked, conversations happen. Pressure is applied quietly, efficiently, without spectacle. Which means that for this clip to surface at all, something went wrong, or someone didn't do what they were supposed to do. Think about that for a moment, not in terms of drama, but in terms of process. Someone, somewhere along the chain, either underestimated the importance of what had been captured or made a conscious decision not to intervene. Both scenarios are revealing. If it was underestimated, that suggests the significance of the moment wasn't immediately recognized internally. That the question, "Why are you here?" didn't ring alarm bells right away. That only later, perhaps after reflection or reaction, did it register as problematic. If it was recognized and still allowed to slip, that suggests something else entirely. A crack in discipline. Or a calculation that letting it leak briefly served a purpose. But whose purpose? This is where the absence of context becomes as important as the clip itself. No one accompanied it with explanation. No one offered a narrative to soften the edges. There was no behind-the-scenes clarification, no friendly source eager to explain that it was all a misunderstanding. That silence isn't neutral, it's strategic. Palaces don't rush to explain when explanations create more questions than they answer, because to explain the clip, you'd have to explain the appearance. And to explain the appearance, you'd have to explain who authorized it. And that's a line of inquiry no institution enjoys, when the answer isn't clean. So the clip floats, untethered, just enough to unsettle, not enough to resolve. And that's when people start filling in the gaps. You can see it in the way discussions unfold. They don't focus on outrage. They focus on logistics, on the how, not just the why. How did she get there? How was this not anticipated? How did the camera remain on long enough to capture the exchange? Those are insider questions. Questions asked by people who understand that the palace's greatest strength, control, is also its greatest vulnerability. Because control creates expectation, and expectation makes breaches visible. Now, let's talk about timing again, because timing always comes back around. The clip didn't surface during a moment of stability. It emerged during a period when every internal misstep feels amplified, when authority is being actively established, not inherited by default, when the margin for surprise is thin. That matters. In calmer times, this moment might have been quietly smoothed over. In tenser times, it becomes a fault line, and you can feel that tension in the way the clip was handled. Not denied, not acknowledged, just managed. Pushed to the edges. Allowed to fade without ever being addressed head-on. That's not accidental. It's containment. But containment doesn't erase memory. It just delays reckoning. There's another detail that keeps resurfacing among those who saw the footage early. The camera doesn't immediately cut away after the question. There's a beat, a pause that feels longer than it probably was. A moment where no one quite knows what to do next. That pause is everything, because it tells us the exchange wasn't part of the plan. No one jumps in, no aide steps forward with a rehearsed line. No one laughs it off. The system hesitates. And systems don't hesitate unless they're caught off balance, which brings us back to the original problem. This clip shouldn't exist because the conditions that produce it aren't supposed to occur. And yet, they did. So something failed. Or someone pushed. And before you ask, yes, those are very different scenarios. Failure implies weakness. Pushing implies intent. And institutions respond very differently to each. If this was failure, the response would be internal tightening, new rules, fewer gray areas, less access, quiet consequences. If this was intent, the response would be more subtle, less visible, more about realignment than punishment. Conversations instead of reprimands, signals instead of statements. We don't yet know which it was, but we can look for clues in what happened next. And what happened next is very little, at least on the surface. No leaks explaining the leak, no briefings pointing fingers, no sudden surge of anonymous quotes trying to reframe the moment. Instead, the palace allowed uncertainty to linger. That tells us two things. First, that explaining would have been riskier than remaining silent. And second, that someone believed the story would lose momentum on its own. That belief is understandable. News cycles move fast. Attention shifts. New controversies crowd out old ones. But it underestimates something important. This wasn't spectacle. It was a crack. And cracks don't vanish just because you stop looking at them. They spread quietly, through speculation, through private conversations, through the sense that something is unresolved. And unresolved stories have a way of resurfacing, especially when they touch on authority. Because authority depends on predictability, on the assumption that the people in charge know who is where and why. When that assumption is shaken, even briefly, it leaves a residue. You can see that residue in the way this clip is discussed now. Not loudly, not angrily, but with curiosity. With that careful tone people use when they suspect there's more beneath the surface than they've been shown. And there is more, because the clip wasn't just about a question. It was about access, about boundaries, about who gets to cross them and who decides when. And to understand that, we have to move beyond the footage and into the structure that surrounds it. We have to talk about how Buckingham Palace actually works, about why control is so central to its operation, and about why a single unscheduled appearance can ripple outward far beyond the room in which it occurred. That's where the story deepens. Because once you understand how tightly managed those spaces are, the existence of this clip stops being mysterious. It becomes alarming, and in the next section, we're going to step inside that system. Not the ceremonial version, but the operational one. The one built on protocols, approvals, and an unspoken understanding that nothing and no one moves without clearance. Because once you see how that system is supposed to function, the question, why are you here, takes on an entirely different weight. And what it reveals about what went wrong becomes impossible to ignore. Nothing at Buckingham Palace runs on instinct. That's the mistake people make when they imagine power at this level. They picture personalities clashing, tempers flaring, private arguments spilling into public view. That does happen, of course, but it's not how the institution actually functions day to day. What keeps the place running isn't emotion, it's systems. Layers of them. Systems designed not to react, but to prevent the need for reaction in the first place. Which is why this moment landed so hard internally. Because when control fails, even briefly, it exposes something deeper than embarrassment. It exposes vulnerability. Inside the palace, control isn't about ego, it's about predictability. Every appearance, every movement, every meeting exists inside a lattice of approvals that most people never see. Schedules are drafted, revised, circulated, revised again. Access lists are checked and cross-checked. Rooms are assigned not just for convenience, but for symbolism. Who enters where, from which door, at what time, it all communicates something, even when no one is watching. Especially when no one is watching. This is why unscheduled appearances aren't treated as charming surprises. They're treated as disruptions. They force recalculation. They introduce unknowns. And unknowns are the enemy of institutions that survive on continuity. Here's something that's rarely explained publicly. Inside Buckingham Palace, there is no such thing as casual access. People don't simply drop by. Even family members operate within frameworks. The closer you are to the center, the more structured your movements become, not less. Which brings us back to the moment that triggered the question, why are you here? That question doesn't come from confusion, it comes from misalignment. From realizing that what is happening does not match what was planned. And that realization is not emotional, it's procedural. Somewhere, there was a schedule that did not include this appearance. Somewhere, there was a list that did not include this name. Somewhere, someone assumed those documents were accurate. They weren't. Now, let's talk about why that matters. Because in an institution like this, Authority isn't asserted through confrontation. It's asserted through process, through the quiet confidence that everything is where it should be. When that confidence is shaken, it triggers a cascade. Who approved this? If someone approved it, why wasn't it communicated? If no one approved it, how did it happen anyway? Those questions don't stay abstract for long. They land on desks. They circulate in hushed conversations. They create discomfort among people whose job is to prevent exactly this kind of uncertainty. And here's where things get delicate. Because asking those questions means acknowledging that something slipped through. That control was imperfect. Institutions hate that admission. So instead of answers, you often get tightening. New layers, fewer exceptions, more caution. The response is rarely loud. It's structural. And the fact that we didn't hear anything publicly afterwards suggests that's exactly what happened here. But control isn't just about logistics. It's about narrative, about ensuring that what the public sees aligns with what the institution wants to project. This is where timing becomes critical again. The appearance didn't just disrupt a schedule, it disrupted a story. At a moment when the palace is actively shaping its image, reinforcing stability, projecting authority, an unscripted presence introduces ambiguity. It invites interpretation. And interpretation is dangerous when you're trying to maintain a singular narrative. Ask yourself this: if the appearance had been planned, why not announce it? Why not frame it? Why not get ahead of it? The absence of framing tells us it wasn't meant to be seen. And the presence of irritation tells us it wasn't welcome. This isn't about personal grievance. It's about the erosion of control. And erosion, once it starts, is hard to stop. Because here's the paradox of institutions like this. The more tightly they manage access, the more destabilizing breaches become. A single unsanctioned moment can carry disproportionate weight precisely because everything else is so regulated. That's why the question wasn't softened. There was no small talk, no polite buffer, just a direct challenge to the situation itself. Why are you here? Not who invited you. Not what brings you today. Why are you here? It's the language of process, not emotion. The language of someone trying to reconcile reality with expectation. And when reality doesn't match, the system pauses. You could feel that pause in the room. Even without sound beyond the words themselves, the body language tells the story. The stillness, the lack of immediate correction, the absence of someone stepping in to smooth things over. That's not normal. In well-run operations, someone always steps in. Aides exist for that reason. To absorb shock, to redirect, to ensure the principal never has to confront a procedural failure directly. The fact that this confrontation happened at all suggests the buffers failed or were bypassed, and that raises a more uncomfortable possibility. What if this wasn't just a failure of communication, but a failure of authority? Not in the dramatic sense, not a power grab, but a moment where the usual lines of control didn't hold. Because access isn't just about doors and schedules, it's about permission, about who feels entitled to be there and who feels empowered to stop them. If someone believed they had the right to appear without clearance, that belief didn't come from nowhere. It came from precedent, from past experiences where boundaries were flexible, where exceptions were made. Institutions often regret exceptions long after they're granted, and when they do, they tighten. Hard. Which brings us to what we didn't see after the clip. No smiling follow-up photos. No friendly briefings. No signals of reconciliation or normalcy. Instead, there was distance. Quiet recalibration. A sense that something had shifted, even if no one could quite articulate how. That's what loss of control looks like at this level. Not chaos. Adjustment. People underestimate how much power resides in routines. When routines are disrupted, even subtly, everyone notices. Schedules feel heavier, conversations become more careful, decisions take longer, and those changes ripple outward. There's another detail worth sitting with. The question wasn't asked in public view. It wasn't delivered from a balcony or a podium. It was spoken inside the palace in a space where privacy is assumed. That matters, because it means the speaker didn't expect the moment to travel. He wasn't performing. He wasn't signaling to an audience. He was addressing a problem. And problems addressed privately often reveal more than statements crafted for public consumption. This wasn't meant to be heard, which makes hearing it all the more revealing. It shows us the gap between appearance and reality, between the smooth exterior and the constant effort required to maintain it. And it forces us to confront something uncomfortable. If control can slip here, even briefly, what else has slipped without being noticed? That's the question that lingers inside institutions after moments like this. Not who to blame, but where the system is weakest. Because once a weakness is identified, everything changes. Procedures tighten, access narrows, trust becomes conditional, and relationships that once operated on assumption are suddenly scrutinized. We haven't seen the consequences yet. Or rather, we've seen them indirectly. In the silence, in the absence of reassurance, in the way this story refuses to settle. And that brings us to the next turn. Because control doesn't just fail on its own. It fails at specific points, through specific people, through decisions made quietly, often with the best intentions. To understand how this appearance happened at all, we have to look at the moment before it, at the approvals that didn't happen. Or did, in ways that were misunderstood. We have to talk about authority, about who actually has the power to say yes inside Buckingham Palace. And once you start pulling on that thread, the story becomes less about one unexpected appearance and more about a system struggling to define its boundaries. That's where the real tension lives. And that's where we're going next. Because someone, somewhere, opened a door. No announcement. No advance briefing, no carefully worded line slipped to friendly editors an hour before. Just presence. That's what made it jarring. Not who appeared, but how. Or rather, how she didn't. In the palace ecosystem, absence is as meaningful as presence. When something doesn't happen the way it usually does, alarms don't ring loudly. They hum, low, persistent. Impossible to ignore if you're trained to hear them. This was one of those moments. Because if this appearance had been planned even loosely, even at the last minute, there would have been traces. There always are. A soft alert to security, a note added to a running schedule, a whisper passed along the corridor so no one is caught flat-footed. Even surprise visits are choreographed surprises. The palace does not like being startled. And yet, people were startled. Not theatrically, no gasps, no visible confusion. Just a subtle shift, the kind you only notice if you've spent time around institutions that live and die by preparation. The stillness that comes when someone realizes the script they're holding no longer applies. This is where the story tightens, because the surprise appearance doesn't begin at the moment someone walks into a room. It begins earlier. At the gate. At the desk. At the checkpoint where someone asks a question and receives an answer that feels sufficient at the time. And somewhere along that chain, something gave. Let's talk about that chain for a moment. Not in abstract terms, but in practical ones. Entry into Buckingham Palace isn't a single act, it's a sequence. Each step exists to filter, confirm, and contextualize. Identity is verified. Purpose is logged. Access is granted incrementally, not wholesale. Which means that for someone to appear where they weren't expected, multiple points of resistance had to be bypassed. Or, more likely, reinterpreted. This is how systems fail most often. Not through dramatic breaches, but through assumptions. Through people relying on precedent rather than confirmation. Through the quiet confidence that this must be fine because it usually is. And that confidence can be persuasive. Especially when the person in question isn't unknown. Especially when familiarity blurs caution. That's the uncomfortable truth at the heart of this moment. Familiarity is a shortcut. It allows people to stop asking questions they should probably still ask. And when those questions aren't asked, doors open. Not metaphorically, literally. Now, here's where things get interesting. Because according to multiple accounts, there was no visible scramble when the appearance happened. No aides rushing to intercept. No whispered consultations. No hurried attempts to steer the situation away from cameras or attention. That suggests something important. It suggests that until the very last moment, People assumed this appearance was sanctioned. Let that sink in. They didn't panic because they didn't know they were supposed to, which implies that the system believed, up until it couldn't anymore, that everything was in order. So where did that belief come from? In institutions like this, belief is built on signals. A name on a list, a nod from someone senior, a prior instruction that's never formally revoked. This is fine, that carries more weight than it should. It's rarely a single failure. It's accumulation. And then, suddenly, the person who matters most realizes something is wrong. That's when the question is asked. Why are you here? Not out of hostility, out of recalibration. Because in that moment, the king is doing something very specific. He's not addressing a person. He's addressing a discrepancy, a gap between expectation and reality that has become impossible to ignore. And here's the part that's easy to miss if you're focused only on the confrontation itself. The question is not immediately followed by correction. There's no, this shouldn't be happening, or we'll discuss this later. Just the question, which tells us something else. He's seeking information, not performing authority, but reasserting it by clarifying the situation. That's not the behavior of someone who expected this. It's the behavior of someone who was told, implicitly or explicitly, that this wouldn't happen. Now think about the implications of that. If the king was not briefed on the appearance, then someone failed to brief him. That's a serious lapse. Briefings exist to protect principals from surprises. When they don't, trust erodes. If he was briefed inaccurately, that's even worse. Because misinformation inside a palace doesn't just create confusion, it creates liability. And if he was not briefed at all, because no one thought it necessary, that points to a deeper issue. A culture where assumptions replaced verification. None of those possibilities are comforting, which is why the moment reverberated. Because regardless of which explanation is correct, the outcome is the same. Control was compromised. And here's where the narrative shifts again. Because public discussions tend to focus on the individual at the center of the appearance, on motives, intentions, personal dynamics. But internally, that's not where the scrutiny lands first. Internally, the focus shifts to process. Who signed off? Who didn't? Who assumed? Who failed to question? Those are not emotional inquiries. They're institutional ones. And they can quietly upend careers. This is why silence followed. Not because nothing happened, but because too much did. Because once you start pulling on that thread, it doesn't stop at one person or one moment. It leads back through layers of decision-making, each one revealing a small compromise that, taken alone, seemed harmless. Until it wasn't. There's another detail that complicates this further. The appearance didn't just happen in any space. It happened in a context where visibility mattered, where cameras were present, where optics were already being managed carefully. That suggests someone, at some point, believed this appearance was appropriate, or at least tolerable. And that belief didn't come from nowhere. Which brings us to precedent. Precedent is the quiet architect of institutional behavior. Once something has been allowed before, it becomes easier to allow again. Boundaries soften, exceptions multiply. And eventually, no one remembers where the original line was drawn, until it's crossed too obviously to ignore. That's what this felt like. A moment where precedent finally collided with reality. And the collision produced a question that shouldn't have needed to be asked. Why are you here? Because if boundaries were clear, the answer would have been obvious. The fact that it wasn't tells us those boundaries had already eroded. Now, consider this. If the appearance had been announced, even retroactively, it could have been reframed, positioned as reconciliation, cooperation, or progress. The palace is skilled at narrative recovery when it has material to work with. But there was no recovery attempt. Why? Because reframing requires ownership. It requires saying, yes, this happened, and here's why. And that would have forced the palace to take responsibility for a decision it may not have fully made. Better to let the moment fade than to cement it with explanation. Except moments like this don't fade. They linger. They resurface in conversations, in quiet briefings. In the cautious way future interactions are planned. And they change behavior. After an unscheduled appearance, schedules become stricter, access becomes narrower, assumptions are challenged. The system learns, often harshly. That learning process is invisible to the public, but it's real, and it's ongoing. Which brings us to a question we haven't asked yet, but should. If this appearance wasn't announced because it wasn't planned, and it wasn't planned because no one thought it needed approval, what does that say about how authority was being perceived before this moment? Because authority isn't just about who holds it, it's about who believes in it. And when people stop feeling the need to seek permission, something has already shifted. That shift didn't start here. This was just where it became visible. In the next section, we're going to slow this down even further. We're going to look at the reaction itself, not the words, but the body language, the pauses, the micro signals that reveal more than any statement ever could. Because anger is easy to spot, discomfort is harder. And what we see in that clip isn't explosive. It's controlled, measured, almost weary, which raises a troubling possibility. What if this wasn't the first time the system had been tested? And what if this moment wasn't the cause of the tension, but the symptom? The anger people expected never really arrived. That's the first thing that stands out when you slow the clip down and watch it the way palace staff are trained to watch moments like this. Not for spectacle, not for outrage, but for deviation, for the tiny departures from baseline behavior that signal something deeper is happening beneath the surface. Because if this were anger in the way the public understands it, it would be easier. Anger is expressive. It leaks. It gives itself away. It seeks release. What we see here doesn't do any of that. What we see is containment. The posture doesn't collapse. The voice doesn't rise. There's no sudden movement, forward or backward. No sharp gesture meant to dominate the space. In fact, what's most striking is how little changes physically at all. And that's precisely why it's so revealing. People who spend their lives around power learn quickly that emotional restraint is not the absence of feeling. It's the management of it. And the more experienced someone is, the less they need to perform emotion to assert authority. Which brings us to the look. There's a brief narrowing of focus. Not dramatic, easy to miss if you're not looking for it. The eyes don't widen in surprise, they fix. The head tilts ever so slightly, not as a challenge, but as a recalibration. This is not the body language of someone caught off guard in a chaotic sense. It's the body language of someone realizing the situation they were prepared for does not match the one in front of them. And then comes the pause. That pause matters more than the words themselves. Because in institutional settings, pauses are rarely accidental. They're moments where someone is deciding which framework to apply, which protocol fits what's unfolding. And here, there's hesitation. A fraction of a second where it's clear the usual script doesn't quite work. Only then does the question come. Why are you here? Not rushed, not delayed. Delivered at the exact moment when it becomes clear that silence would allow the anomaly to stand unchallenged. This is where interpretations start to diverge. Some hear anger, others hear disbelief. A few hear something closer to disappointment. But those interpretations assume the question is emotional. What if it's procedural? Because if you listen closely, the question isn't framed around feeling, it's framed around justification. It demands explanation. Not apology, not reassurance, explanation. And that's an important distinction. Explanation is what you ask for when something violates expectation. When something has happened that shouldn't have, and you need to understand how reality diverged from plan, which suggests the emotion underneath isn't rage. It's disruption, and disruption inside a system like this is deeply unsettling. Now consider the environment again. This is not a public-facing moment. This isn't a balcony appearance or a staged greeting where every word is weighed for public interpretation. This is an interior space, a working space, a place where people assume conversations will remain contained. That context changes everything, because it means the question wasn't designed to send a message outward. It was meant to restore order inward. And when you look at it that way, the restraint becomes logical. Raising one's voice would have escalated the situation. It would have turned a procedural problem into an emotional confrontation. It would have invited witnesses into something that should have remained contained. Instead, the question draws a line. Why are you here? It stops the moment from drifting further into unscripted territory. It reasserts hierarchy without overt aggression, and it places the burden of explanation where it belongs, on the person whose presence has created the discrepancy. But here's where the analysis deepens, because the question alone doesn't tell the full story. It's what doesn't follow that reveals the most. There's no immediate correction, no instruction to remove anyone from the room, no visible signal to staff to intervene. The system hesitates. That hesitation suggests uncertainty, not about authority, but about next steps. In other words, the problem has been identified, but the solution isn't immediately obvious. And that's rare. Usually, in situations like this, the response is automatic. Aid steps in, conversation is redirected. Someone offers a neutral explanation to bridge the gap. The principal never has to linger in uncertainty. The fact that none of that happens tells us this moment didn't fit existing categories. It wasn't anticipated. And when things aren't anticipated, even experienced leaders have to improvise. Improvisation, in this context, doesn't mean chaos. It means restraint while options are evaluated. This is where the idea of anger starts to fall apart. Anger simplifies. It narrows choices. It pushes toward action. What we see here does the opposite. It suspends action. It opens a space where information is demanded before decisions are made. That's not emotional volatility. That's control under strain, and control under strain is far more revealing than loss of control, because it tells us the system still believes it can reassert itself, that the breach is manageable, that this is a problem to be solved, not a crisis to be declared, at least in that moment. But the look doesn't soften after the question. There's no quick return to neutrality, no sign that the explanation, whatever it may have been, immediately resolved the issue. Instead, there's a lingering tension, subtle, but present, which raises another possibility. What if the explanation didn't satisfy? What if the answer to, "Why are you here?" was not one the system could easily absorb? We don't hear the response in the clip. Or if it exists, it hasn't surfaced, and that absence invites speculation. But rather than speculate on content, it's more instructive to look at reaction. The reaction suggests unresolved discrepancy. And unresolved discrepancies don't disappear. They get logged, mentally, if not formally. They become reference points in future decisions. Now think about this from the king's perspective, not as a figurehead, but as the central node in a complex operational network. His role in moments like this isn't to vent frustration. It's to identify fault lines. And once identified, those fault lines are monitored, which means this moment likely didn't end when the camera stopped recording. It likely continued in follow-up conversations, in quiet inquiries, in requests for clarification that went beyond the room, because once you see a system falter, you don't just fix the immediate problem, you examine the conditions that allowed it to occur. That's where the real work begins. But here's the part that's hardest for outside observers to grasp. Emotional restraint in public-facing institutions isn't about being calm. It's about preserving optionality. By not escalating emotionally, the king preserved the ability to respond flexibly later. He didn't commit to a narrative in the moment. He didn't lock himself into a visible reaction that would require public justification. He simply marked the anomaly. Why are you here? And then allowed the system to absorb the implications. That's why the clip feels so unsettling, because it captures authority in a moment of recalibration, not assertion. And recalibration is invisible until it isn't. There's another subtle cue worth mentioning. After the question, there's no visible attempt to regain warmth or smoothness. No social lubrication. No effort to pretend everything is fine. That absence tells us the moment was not resolved emotionally. It was deferred. And deferred moments have a way of resurfacing with greater force. Because deferral doesn't mean forgiveness. It means postponement. Now, let's address the idea that this was simply irritation. A bad day. A human moment blown out of proportion. That explanation is comforting because it localizes the issue. It makes it small, but it doesn't align with the response pattern. A bad day produces sharpness, not stillness. It produces reactive gestures, not measured pauses. What we see here is not someone snapping. It's someone encountering an unexpected structural problem and choosing to contain it rather than expose it. That's leadership behavior, not personal irritation. And leadership behavior always has downstream effects. Staff notice it, they adjust, they become more cautious, they tighten procedures, they reinterpret past permissions through a new lens, which means this moment likely altered how access is handled going forward. Not dramatically, not publicly, but incrementally. And incremental change is how institutions actually evolve. Now ask yourself this: if the reaction had been purely emotional, would the palace have remained silent afterward? Or would there have been an effort to contextualize, to reassure, to soften the impression? Silence suggests the reaction was understood internally as justified, not regrettable. Justified. And that tells us something important. It tells us that whatever explanation was offered in the room did not eliminate concern. It did not restore alignment. It did not make the appearance retroactively acceptable. Which means the issue wasn't just the surprise. It was the principle. And principles are harder to negotiate than logistics. Because once a principle is challenged, the response has to be structural, not performative. That brings us back to the expression, the restraint, the lack of escalation. This wasn't a moment meant to end the situation. It was a moment meant to flag it. And flagged issues don't go away quietly. They get investigated, they get discussed, they get remembered. Which leads to the question that lingers long after the clip ends. If this was restraint, not anger, what did it restrain? What impulse was being held back? Because restraint implies effort. It implies something was deliberately not expressed. And whatever that was, it didn't vanish. It was deferred, stored, waiting for a context where it could be addressed without cameras, without witnesses, without the risk of narrative loss. That context may already have occurred, or it may still be coming. But either way, the reaction we see tells us one thing with certainty. This moment was not emotionally resolved. It was administratively noted. And the next phase of this story doesn't unfold in front of cameras. It unfolds in approvals, in permissions, in the quiet narrowing of access that follows a breach of expectation. In the next section, we're going to follow that thread. We're going to look at authority itself, not as a symbol, but as a set of permissions that can be granted, revoked, or quietly redefined. Because once restraint gives way to review, the consequences are rarely visible at first, but they are always felt. And someone was about to feel them. Authority inside Buckingham Palace is often misunderstood. People imagine it as a single lever, a yes or no, a sovereign decision that moves cleanly from top to bottom. In reality, it's more like a network of valves. Pressure flows through it. Permissions are layered. Responsibility is distributed just enough that no single person appears to own the outcome when something goes wrong. That's by design. Because when authority is diffuse, accountability becomes harder to pin down. And when accountability is hard to pin down, institutions protect themselves. Which brings us to the most uncomfortable question raised by this moment. Who actually had the authority to say yes? Because someone, at some point, either explicitly or implicitly, allowed this appearance to happen. Doors don't open themselves. Schedules don't bend on their own. Even assumptions have origins. So, let's dismantle the myth first. There is no scenario in which a surprise appearance inside Buckingham Palace happens without human intervention. Even if no one formally approved it, someone made a judgment call. Someone decided not to challenge it. Someone chose continuity over confrontation. And that choice is a form of authority. The palace operates on tiers. At the top sits the monarch. Below that, senior aides who act as filters, interpreters, and enforcers of intent. Below them, layers of staff whose job is to execute, not to question. Authority moves downward, but so does plausible deniability. This is how institutions survive mistakes, because when something goes wrong, the question isn't just who approved it, it's who believed they were allowed to approve it. That distinction matters. There are people inside the palace whose authority is explicit. They have titles, offices, long-standing roles. Their approvals are documented, their decisions traceable. If one of them had authorized this appearance, the response would likely have been clearer. There would have been a paper trail, a briefing note, something concrete to point to. But the silence that followed suggests that wasn't the case, which points us toward a more ambiguous form of authority, the kind that operates through precedent rather than instruction, through habits rather than rules. This is where things get dangerous, because precedent is invisible until it's broken. If someone has been allowed access before, even under different circumstances, that past access can be misread as ongoing permission. Boundaries blur. Exceptions harden into expectations, and eventually, someone assumes a right that no longer exists, or perhaps never existed in the first place. So imagine the chain of events. Someone approaches a checkpoint, they're recognized, familiar, not a stranger, not an unknown risk. The question isn't, who are you? It's, what brings you today? And the answer sounds reasonable, or at least not alarming. Maybe it references a prior understanding, a previous visit, an assumption that this is already known higher up. This is how authority leaks, not through defiance, but through trust. Trust that no one bothers to verify. And verification is everything in a place like this, because the system depends on people asking questions, even when it feels awkward. Especially when it feels awkward. The moment people stop asking because it feels impolite, or unnecessary, or risky to challenge, the system weakens. That's when surprises happen. Now, consider the alternative. What if someone did authorize it, but didn't communicate that authorization effectively? That's just as problematic, because authority without communication is functionally useless. If approvals aren't disseminated, they don't protect anyone. They create gaps where assumptions fill the void, and gaps are where institutions lose control. This brings us back to the king's reaction, because if authorization existed but wasn't communicated to him, that's a profound failure. Briefings exist to prevent exactly this kind of moment. When a principal asks, "Why are you here?" it signals that whatever approvals may have occurred did not reach the one person who needed to know. That's not a small oversight. It suggests a breakdown in trust between layers of authority. Either someone failed to brief him, or someone believed briefing wasn't necessary. Both imply a misjudgment of the moment's significance. And misjudging significance is often how internal influence shifts quietly, because people begin to act as if they know better than the system. They rely on instinct, on familiarity, on past patterns, and when those instincts clash with current realities, friction emerges. That friction is what we're seeing here. Now let's talk about the possibility no one wants to address openly. What if the authority wasn't formal at all? What if it was assumed? Assumed authority is the most dangerous kind because it's never written down. It exists in tone, in relationships, in the way someone speaks to staff, in the confidence with which they move through space. Assumed authority thrives in environments where boundaries have been flexible in the past. And flexibility, while often praised as humane or progressive, can become a liability when roles are in flux. Think about it. If lines have shifted over time, if access has been granted inconsistently, if rules have been bent quietly to avoid conflict, then eventually someone will cross a line without realizing it's there. And when that happens, the system reacts, not always immediately, not always visibly, but it reacts. That reaction begins with questions. Why are you here? That question isn't just directed outward, it reverberates inward through the layers of authority that allowed the moment to occur. Who let this happen? Who thought this was acceptable? Who failed to clarify? These are not rhetorical questions. They're operational ones, and they don't get answered in public. They get answered in meetings, in memos, in subtle shifts of responsibility, which is why the aftermath looked like nothing. Because something was happening beneath the surface. Now, let's address the idea that perhaps the authority came from a misunderstanding of timing, that someone believed this appearance was aligned with broader goals, that it fit into a narrative of reconciliation or normalization. If that were the case, the reaction would likely have been different. there would have been at least an attempt to salvage the optics, to contextualize, to spin. The absence of spin suggests the narrative didn't exist, or worse, that it existed in someone's mind but not in reality. That's another form of assumed authority, the belief that one's interpretation of intent is sufficient. Institutions do not forgive that easily, because intent without alignment is chaos, and alignment is the currency of power here. Which brings us to another uncomfortable truth. Authority inside the palace is not static. It shifts with time, with reigns, with changing expectations. What was tolerated under one configuration may not be under another. People who fail to adjust to that reality often find themselves operating on outdated assumptions, and outdated assumptions are a recipe for moments like this. So when the king asks, "Why are you here?" he may not just be questioning the immediate situation, he may be signaling that the rules have changed, that old understandings no longer apply. And that's a destabilizing message, because it forces everyone listening to reevaluate what they thought they knew. Now consider the staff present in that room. They're not just witnesses, they're participants in the system. They hear that question and they register its implications. They note who looks surprised, who looks defensive, who looks uncertain. Those observations don't disappear. They inform future decisions. Who is trusted? Who is consulted? Who is kept at arm's length? Authority in this sense isn't just about saying yes or no. It's about shaping the environment in which those answers are possible. And this moment reshaped that environment, because once authority is questioned, even quietly, it has to be reasserted somewhere else. Not necessarily through confrontation, often through restriction. Access becomes harder. Permissions take longer. Assumptions are challenged. This is how institutions correct course without admitting error. And the person who feels that correction most acutely is often the one who triggered it. Not through punishment, but through distance. Which brings us to a key point. The absence of public fallout does not mean there was no consequence. It often means the consequences were internal, structural, and ongoing. And those consequences rarely announce themselves. They show up later, in denied requests, in delayed responses, in doors that once opened easily, now requiring explanation. Which leads to the question that hangs over this entire episode. Was this appearance an assertion of access, or was it the moment that access quietly narrowed? Because authority, once tested, does not remain unchanged. It responds, sometimes by flexing, sometimes by retreating, and sometimes by drawing lines more sharply than before. We haven't yet seen where those lines were redrawn, but we can infer that they were, because institutions do not absorb shocks without adjustment. And this shock, however contained, was real. In the next section,